We'll move on to the fourth presentation, which is given by Katharina Meitinger, who is of Utrecht University. And she will talk about an entirely different innovation, I think, in surveys, and that is the use of voice recordings. So we can see your screen, I think, Katharina. And,
wonderful.
We can also hear you, so the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you, Peter, for the introduction. Yeah, so like I will talk now about implementing voice recording in a probability-based panel, what we learned so far. So in the next couple of minutes, and this is collaborative work with Sabine van der Slaus and Matthias Schonlau. So in the next couple of minutes, I want to tell you a bit about the current findings that we had so far in a study that we conducted in the LIST panel, where we implemented an experiment on the willingness and the preference for audio recordings to answer open-ended questions. So why would we do that? Because like there is like currently an increase in surveys using audio recordings. So therefore, like respondents can, instead of typing their answer to an open-ended question, just push a button and record their audio response. But previous research mostly focused on mobile surveys, used predominantly non-probability access panels, mostly studied younger participants, in particular millennials, and studied hypothetical and actual willingness. They were like feasibility studies where respondents had only the option to do a voice recording, but also experimental studies regarding willingness, where there was a control group with a written response option and like an experimental group where respondents could do the voice recording. Right now, there are a couple of research gaps with regard to audio recordings in surveys. Like so far, audio recordings have not really implemented in web surveys where like we have a mixed device setting. You have smartphones, but also PC users. They are also not implemented in probability-based surveys of the general population. Another issue with regard to audio recordings in survey is the issue of screen out due to technical or legal issues. And what has not been done so far is the comparison of the willingness and the preference. Preference meaning that we give the respondents to choice between the written response option and the audio response option. And finally, audio surveys heavily hinge on the performance of automatic speech recognition. That means that the audio data is automatically transcribed to written text, and this performance might differ by subgroups. Therefore, I want to talk about 3 research questions today. First of all, which respondents actually provide voice recordings? The second one is, does response quality differ between voice recordings and written text responses? And third, which subgroups and contextual factors affect the performance of the automatic speech recognition? The data that I talk about today was collected in the LIST panel. This is a probability-based panel of the Dutch general population. We had an age range between 16 and 97 years. Data was collected in December 2020. The survey took 5 minutes to complete, and 3,415 respondents started the survey and 2,237 respondents completed the survey. Here you can see the experimental design. We had one control group where the respondents were asked to write the response. We had a willingness group where the respondents were basically forced to give an audio response that was their only option. And we had a preference condition where respondents could choose between giving a written response and the audio response. In the lower left bottom, you see how the written response option looked like. And in the lower right bottom, you see how the audio setup looked like. Here, respondents could just push on start and then do the audio recording. The first research question was which respondents provided voice recordings, and I mentioned the issue of screen outs. That is basically do respondents comply to the technical and legal standards to actually provide an audio recording? And this applies in particular, like only for the respondents that were asked to provide an audio recording. And we were actually losing a lot of respondents due to the initial screen out. We used the software QuestFox that was only able to, on Android phones, and could not process Safari users on PCs. So we actually lost quite some respondents at this initial state, but also respondents pointed out that the situation does not allow for a voice recording. They also pointed out that the device that they had did not have a microphone that was ready to be used. And finally, respondents also did not give the permission to store their audio recordings. This meant that before the actual survey started, our sample was of audio respondents was already reduced to only 22% of the initial audio respondents, and they were all cut due to screen outs. And like the question is, are those screen outs actually biased? Like, do we have a biasing effect here? And yes, we do. Like, how, in particular, household income and like being a woman increases the screen out, as like education has a like reducing effect of screen out. We see that also for the microphone ready to be used screen out, but age also increases the likelihood of being screened out. After the screen out, when the respondents were actually providing an audio recording, the respondents received 2 different substantive questions, one on economy and one on minority. And like how many respondents were then willing to provide an audio response when there is no alternative, when they were assigned to this audio condition. And we see that if respondents are forced to give an audio response, the willingness is actually quite high, like roughly around 80% for both questions. And who is willing to provide audio recordings? We wanted to know, are there significant predictors whether the respondent provides and is willing to provide an audio recording or not. And we find surprisingly that none of the predictors that we selected were significant, and we were distinguishing between gender, age, education, mobile usage, being at home or not, being alone or not, and whether the response has trust in the anonymity of the data usage. With regard to the choice condition, when we gave the respondents the option to either give a written or audio response, we see that like the vast majority of respondents is opting for a written response, and only 6% of the respondents was actually preferring to give an audio response. And are there any significant predictors of preference for audio recordings? And we see that, yes, like higher level of education increases like the likelihood that a respondent provides an audio recording. The second research question that we had was, does response quality differ between voice recordings and written text responses? And we see that if we force respondents to provide an audio recording, this leads to a larger increased break-off in comparison to the other experimental groups. And it increases also the response length, but it reduces the number of themes, indicating that audio respondents give less concise responses than the other conditions. Finally, our third question was, which subgroups and contextual factors affect the performance of automatic speech recognition? Automatic speech recognition being like a transcription of the audio data into written text. And here we see like a visualization, and previous research indicated that gender, age, device, background noise, social context, and location could have like a distorting effect on the automatic speech recognition. And we asked then which subgroups and contextual factors could affect the performance of automatic speech recognition. And luckily, or like the positive thing is that we only found that background noise was significantly increasing the word error rate of the automatic transcription, but we don't find, for example, group differences or like biasing effects by gender and age. To conclude, with regard to screen out, we see if we add an audio option, a lot of respondents are screened out, and we basically creating a bit of a bias sample because we have like a lot of significant predictors such as household income, gender, and education that basically has an impact on who is being screened out or not. With regard to the willingness, if respondents are only receiving the audio option, we see that most respondents are willing to provide an audio recording, and we don't find any significant predictors with regard to willingness. With regard to preference, we see that when given the choice, few respondents are actually opting for the audio response. With regard to response quality, we saw that the audio-only option leads to an increased break-off, longer responses, and fewer themes mentioned. And finally, the automatic transcription of audio responses, we did not find a group bias in the ASR performance, which is very nice, but the background noise increases the word error rate. Like therefore, for example, if you create a survey including the audio, an audio recording, you should point out to the respondents in the invitation letter, for example, that respondents should do their recording in a quiet place. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. The floor is open for questions, and there was already one question in the chat that we'll start with. And that question is, do you know of any studies that have compared participation rate for this method, voice recordings, to text messaging? So I can imagine that voice recordings are particularly interesting when you have mobile phones, because that's a common way to communicate.
Definitely, I see that, but I don't know about any study using text messages.
All right, any other questions? You can also raise your hand if you have a question now. You don't want to type it in the chat. If not, I'm going to ask a question. So you presented a slide where you showed that most panel participants had a strong preference for survey questions, right, rather than voice recordings. And that's something that you, I think, quite commonly find when you do these kind of things in panels where people are very used to do surveys, that if you then present them something new, either sometimes there's a novelty effect, right? So people are happy to try it once, but then when you ask them, like, would you like to do this again? Or from now on, people are very hesitant. So what would you say if you would, what are the advantages of voice recordings in like fresh panels or maybe in more cross-sectional surveys? Do you have any signs from the literature or your own experience that it's maybe more promising in a way as a method from the respondent's point of view?
I'm not sure, because like if you think about the list panel, is also a very particular panel where the respondents are very used to doing non-standard survey tasks, right? Like there's like quite commonly like inquiries besides just filling out a questionnaire. So like I was actually expecting that they are like a bit more open, like or more open for it, or like more curious. But we were also actually asking open-ended questions about the experience and why they were willing or not willing to do the audio recording, or like well they did select the written response option. And one of the findings is that respondents are very like they feel it's a very awkward situation, right? They don't want to listen to their own voice. It's like, and so I think if you would like to increase the willingness or to do this kind of task, then you might have to think about how to present it as a less awkward task. I'm not sure whether it in a cross-sectional panel or cross-sectional survey, it might be necessarily different.
Right, thanks. There's another question that is about the processing of the audio responses. So you said something about that very shortly, but can you maybe expand on how you then process the answers that you get, the voice to text, and how did you then proceed?
So this is automatically done, right? If you use the software QuestFox, it's doing it automatically. So like there is already an algorithm in place. So it gives you basically, you have the audio recording and you have the automatic transcription, and then you also get like a quality indicator how good the transcription was. Yeah.
And did you then do further processing of the text? So to just get out all the noise that you notice that is sometimes there, right? Or background or fillers that people may use in their audio recordings?
Yes, so like in the the research that was done mostly by Sabienne van der Slaus, she was actually coding both, right? So she was listening to the audio recordings, and she was then really developing a coding scheme, like coding there was a background noise, what type of background noise was there.
All right, the final, I think it's more a remark, but maybe it's also a question by Tanya. Tanya, do you want to maybe, you raised a couple of issues, so.
Oh, I was just commiserating on the challenges with data collection with, we had trouble with our iPhones. They just, sometimes they would just not be able to click on the record. And so we just opened a Google voicemail and had people just call and leave a voicemail, which then Google does their initial translation. And then we had some project assistants go through them and correct it. And when people are very clear and there's no background noise, Google does a pretty good job, but you're absolutely right. If they're outside or anything's going on, then it's a mess, and they actually had to type everything. So I relate.
All right, to follow up on this, I think there's one last question by Tess Janisch. What is the data quality that you get out of this? So she notes that often this speech to text is very inaccurate. What are your experiences here?
So actually the data quality is quite good, but I think in half of the responses there was some issue, right? Like the text was not largely distorted, but there were some issues, and like it's actually quite frequently.
All right, we are at the end of the time for this session, I'm afraid. So thanks to you, Katharina, and thanks to all the presenters actually for presenting and everyone participating in this discussion. I know that there are a couple of points that have been raised in the chats that we have not had time for to discuss like more, but it's time for a break. I think I'm giving the floor back to Tara and or someone else. I know there's a break now until for the next 15 minutes. But if Tara wants to add something to that, I think the floor is yours now.